This tutorial was released early on the Patreon, and there are also a few on there that are exclusive that go a little bit more in depth on the way that I render. Hey guys, it's Bobon and I'm back with another video, and this one was going to be part of another video, but it kind of ended up on a little bit of a tangent, so I thought it was maybe better to do this as its own video. And I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to call value hierarchies. So what I want to start off with, and I've got a lot of samples here that I'm going to show as I go along. What I want to start off with, a basic circle that you would see when people do little value and lighting studies. Just very, 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 very basic. What we want to start off with is just a midtone, like this. Let's make the background darker so we can see what we're looking at. This is what you're going to start out with, most likely, when you are going to color or shade something. The next thing you're going to add on is a second value, which would be the shadow. We essentially need at least two values to be able to define a form like this. So some little examples of things that I've done that are just these two values would be this kind of thing, things that are a little bit more graphic. So all we've got is something to define where the light is, or maybe even just the shape of something. I'll kind of use lines as this sometimes. That could be your second value. And it will just essentially be two values to define the form. Okay, so if we copy paste this and move over, the next thing that you would likely add on would be a highlight. So now we've moved on to three values, and some samples of this, where I'd use this, would be little kind of chibi things like this, or things where I just want a little bit of kind of what I'd call selective shading, where it's not necessarily defining the form perfectly as though the light was hitting it, but something a bit more graphic to define where we have things that are further back, like the legs are further back than the torso. The tail is also behind the rest of the body. On this one, we also have that on the horse here, with the back legs and the underside of the tail being shaded and arms that are further back. And this one is a little bit more simple. We don't quite have three, but in this one I would likely count these darker, heavier lines as my shadow. And then I have those tiny little highlights there. I have a little bit of highlight on the eyes in these. And then also, this is something I'll use with emotes. So I've got my basic kind of, you can especially see it in the hair. I have the shadow and the midtone and the highlight through here. Also in the face, there is a little bit of gradient for color variation, but you can see the light skin tone, and then the shadow, and then highlight on the nose. The next thing that I would add would be a core shadow, and you can see this in quite a lot of the cell shaded pieces that I've done. But what I will do is add a little band of a slightly darker color in between the shadow and the midtone, like this. And some samples that I have of this that are a little bit easier to see. You can kind of see this around the faces anywhere that I've got these little edges outlined with that darker value. And I do tend to wash them out a little bit more. You can see it on this one as well, around the cheeks, and especially along the edge of these trousers down this way. The next thing after that, as we go into 5 different values, is to bring in some bounce light. And I'll usually do this at the opposite side to where I have my highlight, like so, and that gives us a nice edge to the shape on the opposite side. If I zoom in on these ones, you can see, and let's start looking at it in grayscale actually, you can see that I have mid-tone on the legs and the arms. It's quite obvious. You've got mid-tone, a little bit of highlight. We've got the shadow here. There's a very, very, very small kind of core shadow in there. And then we've got our bounce light from the environment there that's tinting it a little bit more green. And another sample of this is the previous one that we did, where you can see, again, mid-tones. I didn't add core shadow on this one actually, but you can see that bounce light on him. And then lastly, what I would add, like I mentioned in the tutorial that I did with that last little guy, and I'm gonna have to add a shadow underneath this to show this one. We're gonna have what I would consider part of the shadow, what would be the cast shadow from an object. Next thing we would have would be occlusion shadows that I mentioned hang out in the little kind of crevices like this where the light isn't going to hit. So that would be just kind of directly under here and then fade out as we got further away from it. And some samples of this, like I mentioned in one of the earlier ones, I will sometimes use the heavy line art for this. So for example, up in the hair here, right in the very, very corner of it, I have my heavy lines. I've got a little bit of it around the creases on the hands. I've got it underneath the chin here, in the ear, and a tiny bit just in this little crevice in here to define those occlusion shadows, even though everything is a little bit more sort of painted and rendered out on this one, but still covers the range of the rest of the values that I've gone over. That's also the case on this one, where I've got my line art a little bit heavier, just anywhere that I want to account for those occlusion shadows without actually having to go in and render them. And then by the same process, there is something like this that is completely towards the other end, where I am rendering that in rather than using my heavy lines as a sub for those occlusion shadows. I've actually gone in and painted them in, so you can see little kind of corners in here, under here, anywhere underneath the jewelry. We've got quite a lot of cast shadows from those as well, like around here, and little creases, creases, creases in here where I've painted them in. So that's basically the way I will think about how I'm lighting something, and they don't all necessarily have to be very sharp like this. You can see there's a range of sharper edges and more soft rendered pieces in these. I could, just to give a better example, soften out these edges and it will start to look a little bit more like a traditional sort of orb study, like so. And I don't think art style is dependent on which ones of these you use. Towards the left side, I do have a lot of more simple chibi pieces, but you could also do something that is more realistically proportioned with just two values. For example, the skull is a little bit more like that, even though I have more simplified things over here. So you shouldn't feel like you need to stick to more rendered stuff if you want to use the full range of these values. I just tend to do a lot of more cartoony stuff that lends itself to having a reduced range of values to make it more crisp and clear and visible and easily readable at a smaller scale, which would make any further additions of more values redundant, because as they get smaller, they're not going to be as visible. Okay, so let's go over these and recap. So we can have 2 values with the midtone and the shadow. We can have 3 values midtone, shadow, and highlight. We can have 4 values with the midtone, highlight, core shadow, and the shadow. We can do 5 values with highlight, midtone, core shadow, shadow, and bounce light. And then 6 values, mid, highlight, core shadow, shadow, which we would also count with this cast shadow. We have occlusion shadow in here, and that bounce light again. And as I've mentioned, in this range, kind of between 4 and 5 and 6, I'll sometimes use my lines to account for the occlusion shadow. You can also use very heavy lines and kind of account for either like core shadows or just the shadow on its own, with that kind of heavy inking style. And I also may swap around whether I want to use bounce light and a core shadow, or whether I just want to use bounce light and no core shadow, or core shadow and no bounce light. So they could always be swapped in the order of this, but this is the general order that I will add things depending on how detailed I think it needs to be for what I'm working on. And there we go, we're done. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped. If it did, give us a like, share if you think it'll help someone else, and subscribe for new videos when I have them. They are coming out more often on the Patreon now though. Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.